have left out, or it was taped over, that I want to correct now. In telling about my pretty Christmas dresses, I told about the red flannel and the navy blue velvet. Also, the first one I had when I was in the first grade was a cream cashmere embroidered in pink, and that was beautiful for Christmas, and I set a recitation in that, of course. And I had a tan flannel trimmed in pink flannel one year as a two-piece dress to wear for my winter best dress. In telling the records that were in the old record player here, I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles was one, and Come Back to Erin. I left off, or I told it, and it was taped over about cleaning out the milk well. We had the milk well that went all the way down, not to the water, but almost to it, to keep our milk in the wintertime, in the summertime. And it had a crate, and this had two shelves, and the milk and butter was put on this. In the spring it needed cleaning out, so since I was the youngest, I was the one to go down and sweep it up in a cardboard lid and bring it out. And my dad was at the witness, so I wasn't one bit afraid. One time when I was little, Mom and Dad went someplace, and I was left at home with the older ones, and I fell out the back door step and cut my chin on a rock. I really bellowed and took on, and they were so uneasy. They had Aunt Ada come down there too, from next door, Mama's sister. But I got all right, but I still have that scar under my chin, but I love the attention. I was told about Mama getting to play her piano, and because nobody was learning to play, she traded for a straight one. And after that, Jo did learn to play. She took piano lessons in high school, and she was the one who played at church until she was married. Mama made beautiful tough bedspreads, and I have two of them now that are beautiful, that she did laid off the designs and made herself. I want to tell too about the Baptizings down at the river. We're held sometimes down at the Hoosiers Fair, which my daddy owned half of, and most of the time though at the Hall Fair, where Uncle John and Uncle Black Hall owned. And that was where I was baptized in 1929. I still remember the dress I wore, which was a tan pongee dress trimmed in green with a double lustre brown collar that Mama would make for me so pretty. And the people who were baptized and the ministers would come to our house to dress, to take off the wet clothes to go on to church, because we lived near the river. In telling about my dad being a Mason, I should have told that they held his grave service when he died and was buried on August the 20th, 1944. It was erased off what I told about starting school. I started my first year of school at Piney Ridge, which was a one-teacher school, and it was down the road right close to Mr. Plez Matthews' house now. We had a one-teacher school. Mr. Owen Reese was the teacher, and the main thing I remember about that year, at Christmas time, he treated as the teachers did then, which was the custom, and he let me give out the treats. And I'd rather done that than been present. He had a long stick of peppermint candy, big stick, it would cost $1 now, I'm sure, and inside was peanut butter. During that year, there's one thing I did that I'll never forget, and that was they had rubber bands on the arithmetic books the older students did, and that was from the lesson to the answers in the back of the book, so they could turn hurriedly there. Well, I wanted a rubber band. I don't think I'd ever had one at that time, so I took one off somebody's book, and that worried me afterwards because I knew that was wrong. Then the next year was Friendship School, which they consolidated Angel School and Friendship and Piney Ridge to make Friendship School. And my dad had been on the building committee. He was chairman of it to build this school, and this was a three-teacher school, so this was really a big one and a nice school. I used to sit in there near the folding doors that had his name on them because they were shipped to him, and felt very proud of seeing my dad's name there on the doors. My first teacher was Mr. Plez Matthews, and he was a young man who lived there in the community. And I know Annie Pearl Angel, a cousin of mine, would play sick, get to go outside. and we'd sit in the sun out there and laugh and have fun. And we did that several times, but he finally caught up with us, and he quit letting us do that. And this Miss Della Williams is my second grade teacher, and third grade teacher is Miss Eulalia Brandon, fourth grade teacher Miss Jessie Horn, fifth grade teacher Willie Taylor, sixth grade Mr. Collins, and seventh grade Willie Taylor. And I tried to do well in my schoolwork, which I think I did. Going back to the World War I, Travis was in the Navy in World War I, he and Hope Hall. I don't remember his leaving, but I remember when he came home, he had the measles. And I fanned him on the cot upstairs in the north room to keep him cool, and I was the first one to take the measles. I also remember going to a funeral at New Home Church for the influenza that came along about that time, and that's the main thing I remember about that influenza, and a lady having acidity around her neck. I told about the singing school at Friendship one summer, and we would sing, "Let us endeavor to show whenever we join in a song, keep time together." That was one they taught us to keep the right time, and also "Row, row your wee boat down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream." I do know the tune to that, but I won't sing it now. I want to correct about the high school teachers. Miss King came to us when I was in the 9th grade and taught us biology, and she was not there in the 11th because she stayed 2 years. When they had barn raisins and house raisins, this was before my time, and I don't remember anybody ever having a house raising, but I remember a barn raising in our community. After I was grown, Mr. Vance Culler and his wife Miss Florence moved back in our community and lived off of the road to the left, like going up to the church. And they had a house there, but they needed a barn, so he had a barn raised. My daddy went, and I remember him telling he carried a corner. That meant he was responsible for that corner, the logs in that corner, to notch them and make them fit. And so they had one at each corner doing that, and that was a barn raising. I've told about the Primitive Baptists and going to their services and the foot washings and all at Holly Springs. And the halls were the Missionary Baptists, which we called back then, and they had started the East Bend Baptist Church at my great-granddaddy Hall's plantation, and there was a marker out in the yard at the East Bend Baptist Church telling about this. And it was Thomas Hall III. He had married Rebecca Martin Carter, and they were the ones who started the East Bend Baptist Church that was first called Mount Gilead. I've always heard one extreme weather follows another, and in the summer of 1916 there was a flood, and I've heard them talk about it, of course I don't remember it. The very worst floods ever been on the Yadkin River down below our home place. And also that winter, the river froze over, and they drove wagons across it. And it was the hardest ice they'd ever had on the Yadkin River down there. There were spankings, of course, back in my time, but I think by the time I came along, being the youngest, they'd kind of given out spanking, because I don't remember being given but one spanking by my dad and one by my mama. I think I really deserved the one by mama, because we were playing upstairs in the guest bedroom, and I took Joe's doll by the feet and hit it down against the floor, and there was carpet on the floor, but it was the old-fashioned carpet in widths, and it was tacked, and I hit it right on a tack, and the head broke. Well, Joe started bellowing, and Mama wanted to know what was wrong, and Joe told her, and she sent Joe to get a switch. Well, Joe got a good size one, and I got that switch in, and I think I deserved it. The only time that my dad spanked me was he told us to always help Mama about the dishes, and we didn't pay too much attention to it because we thought he had gone that day, and we went down swinging on the side of the hill on a big oak limbs, which was a good place to swing. And he came back to the house for something and found us not helping Mama with the dishes, so he came down with a switch. And Jip was swinging at the time, and he started switching on her first, and she says, y'all quit that, because she thought it was us who was hitting her. But it wasn't. When she saw who it was, she stopped swinging around up the hill, and I ran too. And I was the slowest runner, so I got 2 licks, I think, as I was going up the hill from my daddy's switch. In our childhood, we scarcely ever heard of a golden wedding because people didn't live that long at the time. The only one I remember going to growing up was to Grandma Fletcher's sister's Aunt Sally Binkley. They called her Aunt Dot Binkley, and Uncle Hamp Binkley, her husband, down in the Baltimore section of Yadkin County. And we had pictures made, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. It was like a surprise birthday dinner with a big table full of food outside. Some of the childhood games I've told about, and Blind Man's Buff was one we played, and we played cat ball. That just took 4 players, 2 batters and 2 catchers. We played Anthony Over with the ball going over the well house. That's where we played Anthony Over, the brick well house. We played tap, drop the handkerchief, go sheepy, and Needle's Eye, and that was the one that I've told about playing the first year I was in school at Piney Ridge. Needle's eye, thread supply, the thread that runs the true, and every one of I let go for the sake of catching you. Another thing we were afraid of as a child were the gypsies. They came around in old cars with a load of children, so I don't know why they would have wanted any more children, but we always thought they would steal children. And so when they said the gypsies were coming, we were really frightened and tried to get where they would not see us. But they did stop along, and they wanted to get things to eat and things like that. And you never hear of that anymore. We played rook as a child, and that was one card game that we played. I never played bridge until I was grown and going to college. Up at Aunt Del Angel's, they played flinch, which we never had at our house, but we played flinch up there, another card game. Old-fashioned flowers that we had at home were hollyhocks, and they grew out there by the garden, and they were beautiful. And I would catch bees in them, because bees were in them a lot, and hold them and hear the bees zizz and zizz, and that was a lot of fun. We had zinnias, and we saved the seed to plant those again. We had hydrangeas that you watered them with blue in water, and they would turn from pink to blue. I remember Mama wanted a flower rack, and she had my daddy have make one out of a corded bed that was upstairs in Granddaddy Hall's old house, which would have been worth a lot today, but that was made into a flower rack with a pretty post at each end, like a baker's rack. We had fruit trees, apples, Sally apples, magnabonums, and different ones like that. We had pear trees, a lot of those, and back then people had fruit trees in their yards, and we had a lot of pear trees in the yard there. Had cherry trees out in the garden and also down there in the yard, and they were the black heart cherries, the sweetheart cherries, and the May cherries, which were the best canning and to make pies. I don't remember ever milking but one time, and that was when Mama was sick after Papa was gone, because both of them could milk, and so they always looked after that, but I did milk one time. There were no blacks in our community, as I remember, at all, and we did have black boys to stay with us in the summertime and help with the farm work. I remember one was named Reese, and he said Joe was an export driver. One stayed up at Uncle John A. Hall's, who was a brother to him. I remember my first high-heel shoes. That was in high school, and I was chief marshal, which I'd rather do than been than president at all the commencement programs. I was usher, and I had on new high heels, and I fell up the steps when I started to take the principal a message. We had autograph books in high school. I had one in the 10th grade and one in the 11th grade, my senior year, and classmates and friends wrote in these, and I still have them. I hope I'm not mentioning twice about the cloverleaf salve and rosemary salve. The companies would send a box of it to you, and if you sold it all, they would give you a prize. And I know Joe and Pansy did that, and I went along with them. I never did do it myself. There were also books called the Lee Order books, and they had beautiful, beautiful glass. And all the pretty glass I have from Mama came out of these Lee order books when a girl would go around through the community taking orders, and then it would come and that she would bring it to you. Back then you had to go to the mill to get your corn and wheat, and you had to shell it. As I said, we had a corn sheller, one ear at a time, and the corn would be ground into cornmeal for cornbread. The wheat would be ground into flour for the biscuits and light rolls and bread. I think that later on we bought flour and cornmeal too. But I remember when I started teaching the first year at Fall Creek, I looked down the road and I saw my daddy come out the road with those two pretty horses with a load to go to the 5 Fork Roll Mill right above the school. Of course, a lot of this was for feed, and it wasn't all, wasn't for us to use in cooking. I remember going to the Rural Care Mill Care's picnic down at Donny Hall, and they couldn't have it there, so they had it at Mr. Neil Hooser's, which I later met his daughter when I started high school, but I didn't know at that time. It was a beautiful grove of trees there, and he invited them to have it there. But that morning when we were getting ready to go, Mama got me ready first, and then she got herself ready, and I was so busybody while she had a pan of water there to dampen her hair in her bedroom. I sat down in the pan of water, and she had to dress me all over again. She didn't spank me, but she should have. We used the seesaw a lot to play too. We had one out at the wood pile, and we had it on the sawbuck where they used to saw wood. And I told about cutting the wheat and rye and the bundles that were carried, the wheat and the rye, and the bundles were carried. And you'd put a dozen or more in one place, the bundles, and then they would stack it, and it looked like a teepee. And it was put there until it all dried out. And if it rained, it was all right because it was capped over with bundles. When it came a big snow in the community, different neighbors would take their sleds with their horses and drag out paths for the people in the neighborhood. Now, one neighbor might do it one time and one another, but that way you didn't have to walk through the deep snow. The deepest snow I remember was a year I was a junior in high school, I believe it was, and it came such a deep snow. I wanted to tell this color scheme verse that I've heard all my life, the verses about the different colors. And it goes like this: married in white, you're chosen all right. Married in blue, you'll always be true. Married in green, you're seen to be seen. Married in red, you'll wish yourself dead. Married in brown, you will live out of town. Married in gray, you'll live far away. Married in yellow, you're ashamed of your fellow. Married in black, you'll wish yourself back. We used oil lamps, as I've said, and I used red kerosene or plain kerosene, and Bessie used to wash the chimneys of the lamps on Saturday and filled them up with lamp oil, and I never was allowed to do that since I was the youngest. But one time we were upstairs and had the lamp where we could see in the mirror to fix up pretty, and the wind was blowing and the lamp went down in the oil, I said, and I yelled out, "The lamp's going down in the oil," and I threw it out the window because it was dangerous to have that lamp explode. We had Sunday school conventions in the summertime, and our Friendship Sunday School always gave a program, as well as the other Sunday schools in Fall Creek Township. And one time we did the 10 Virgins with the lamps, and we carried oil lamps lit like that without a chimney on them. And I know Lexi Angels went down the oil when we were standing up there at the pulpit, and she tossed it out the window. The oil lamp was also used to put the hair curlers in to heat them, to weigh your hair. Of course, mine being naturally curly, I didn't have to do that. We took our baths in a galvanized tub that was also used for washing the family wash. And in the summertime, that warm water for bathing was warmed by the sun in one of the big galvanized tubs. I remember having a high chair and a cradle, which was oak, and they were pretty. Mama passed them on to Aunt Dale Angel, and I never did get them back. We had a corn popper too, and we popped popcorn there at the fireplace in Mama and Papa's room. We didn't have any sheep, but I've heard my daddy say that Grandpa Hall had sheep, and they would kill them for mutton. and that sheep would lay its head on the chop block just so humble-like for its head to be cut off. We had beef when somebody in the neighborhood killed a cow and brought it around, and Mama didn't want to buy it then if she didn't know the cow and the person selling it very well. But that was good, the way she fixed country-style steak out of that. We had parties, and up until the time that I graduated high school, I don't remember any refreshments being served at parties except watermelon when we had watermelon in the summertime. Another game we played was scissors, and that was fun to play at a party. I had a senior party when I graduated high school, the next night after we graduated, called the farewell party. And for that time, we did serve refreshments in the dining room, had the table decorated with blue and white, which was our class colors. And I remember Irene Hall came down there and helped me with it, as well as Mom and Bess. But we did have watermelon feast a lot of times. And when I was in elementary school, as well as when I got on to high school, they had spelling bees at Friendship School. And that was when two people chose up the players, and you spelled, and when you got to the end, you crossed over and told the number of your team, and the one that got the most scores for crossing over was the winner. I told about the pie suppers and box suppers. And of course the box suppers were older custom and decorated and pretty with crepe paper, and the boyfriend bought the box and you ate the supper together. Later on they had pie suppers the same way. They were not as much trouble to fix as the box suppers. I remember picking blackberries to sell, and they were 12.5 cents a gallon. Big price, wasn't it? We didn't have any paved roads out my way when we were growing up. They were paved later on when I was older, and we had a lot of red mud. And as I told about buying the new car my dad did in 1919, brand new Ford and Twin City Motor Company. Then later on we had a 1925 Ford, and then Travis had a 1930 Ford, which was an enclosed model that he let us use. I think you've understood that Mama and two of her sisters married Halls. Aunt Bet and Aunt Ada married Uncle Black and Uncle John Hall, who were brothers. My dad was a cousin of theirs, and we all lived within hollering distance of each other. And it was a good way to grow up. And speaking of our home place, it was built of forest pine lumber, and I want to tell you what forest pine lumber is. It is the virgin timber that grew in a forest, and it was the best lumber you could get. It was about at least 200 years old, the trees were, and they were big ones. And that is the reason the home place has stayed in such good condition, because that's the lumber that was built on hard forest pine. The next thing I want to tell about is making cider. We had plenty of apples, as I've told you, dumpling apples, Sally apples, magnum apples, all kinds. And we made this cider to drink in the summertime, which was so good. And then what was left turned into vinegar, and Mama used it to make her good cucumber pickles. We gathered the apples from the trees, brought them to the cider mill, put them in the press, which was a large thing as big as a gallon bucket or 2-gallon bucket, maybe bigger than that. And you put the apples in there that had been ground, and you pressed them, and the cider ran out. And I would want to drink it just as soon as it was made, but they said it was not good for you to drink while it was warm. But then we took it home and put it in that brick well house, and some of it down in the milk well. And believe you me, it was good to drink then. At one time, Mama fixed some hard cider in the wintertime. She didn't want it to get sour, so she boiled it and put some sugar in it we called it hard cider. And I remember when I was a senior in high school, she had some, and she served it in some company there. Travis and Nell were there, and they had been married long, and some others, and we had that hard cider. And that afternoon I served some to Zeno Wooten, who's a friend of mine, who came to see me, just a friend, not a boyfriend. And I served him some of the hard cider, and we got the giggles all afternoon, and I think the hard cider was the reason. Now, after it turned into, put it in a big wooden keg or barrel, and that's where it turned into vinegar. And it was real, real good vinegar too. I want you to know you couldn't put the cider in anything unless it was the wooden keg or glass gallon jugs that we put it in when it was first made, because anything tin or galvanized, it would be bad for you to drink. It would, and might even poison you. So you had to be careful to put it in glass jars and then in the wooden kegs or barrels. I heard this when I was growing up about Peter DeGroff here in Winston-Salem, who killed Ellen Smith in that park on West End Boulevard. It was on February the 8th, 1894, I've learned since. And it's there near North Broad Street, and he was hanged for it. And there was a song written about it to the tune of How Firm a Foundation, and it went like this. Poor Ellen Smith, how was she found? Shot through the breast, lying cold on the ground. There was also a hanging at Dobson in Surrey County, and Mr. Mel Flynn, a neighbor, bought a picture of it, and we used to go down to visit the girls down there, and we'd see that picture and look at it, because it was something certainly different. Just now I happened to think where I was when I heard about Will Rogers' death. Now this is jumping over several years, but I had never been to the beach, and I had taught school a year, and Pansy was staying with Mr. and Ms. H.H. Faust at High Point and working there after she'd completed her nurse's training. They didn't have any children, so they wanted to take Pansy and me to the beach when they went and rented a cottage down there. And we were down there, and some of them had been to town. We were there at the cottage, and they came back and said Will Rogers had been killed on a flight with Wiley Post in Alaska. Later I saw movies he was in, and I thought how strange to see him in the movies after he's already dead. I want to tell you about the first galoshes I ever saw. It was when I was in the 8th grade in high school, and we went to Mr. Henry Davis's store there in East Bend and got a pair of tan galoshes for me. We had had the black rubber overshoes, but this was my first galoshes. I want to tell some proverbs I heard as a child. Make hay while the sun's shining. A stitch in time saves none. All that glitters is not gold. A rolling stone gathers no moss. Better late than never. Never look a gift horse in the mouth. It's a long lane that has no turn. A watched pot never boils. Birds of a feather flock together. A fool and his money are soon parted. Never put off till tomorrow what can be done today. A barking dog never bites. It never rains but it pours. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Every cloud has a silver lining. Then here are some more old sayings that I heard. Poor as a church mouse, thin as a rail, as fat as a pig, as rough as a gale, as brave as a lion, as spry as a cat, bright as a dollar, weak as a rat, proud as a peacock, sly as a fox, mad as a March hare, strong as an ox, fair as a lily, cross as a bear, pure as an angel, neat as a pin, quick as lightning, ugly as sin, dead as a doornail, white as a sheet, flat as a pancake, red as a beet, crazy as a loon, blind as a bat, sharp as a stick, clean as a whistle, hard as a rock, fine as a fiddle, clear as a bell, dry as a bone, deep as a well, light as a feather, stiff as a poker, green as grass, and busy as a bee. Here's superstitions heard as a child. The days between Christmas and Old Christmas foretells the weather. And also for New Year's, you were supposed to eat black-eyed peas and hog jowl and some greens. I think I've already told about being baptized in the Yadkin River down near Siloam. And the church choir sang at the baptizings, "Shall we gather at the river?" Some memories of childhood now. The Raleigh man came from door to door selling flavors and medicines. There were electric trolley cars in Winston-Salem when we came down here shopping. Now they've gotten some to use from Old Salem to Winston, but they're not exactly the same kind. Remember the Burma shave signs that kept you chuckling is what you read as you traveled by. And the Model T Ford that had to be cranked by hand, and it had high pressure tires that were always blowing out, and you'd have to patch the inner tube to put back in them. You'd have to jack up the wheel, take the tire off, take the inner tube out, patch it, pump it up with a hand pump, put it back in the tire, and put it back on the car. I'll never forget when I graduated high school, one of my classmates, Sarah Parker, spent the night with me. On Saturday morning we had to go practice a play, which was our senior play, and we got out there. A Model A car that Travis was letting us drive had a flat, so we jacked it up and put the extra on. We didn't pretend to fix the flat tire, but we got to practice the play on time. It was a custom a long time ago for old ladies to smoke pipes, and I remember seeing one who did this. It was Miss Frankie Smitherman, and Uncle John Culler and his wife took care of her, and we would go down there and sit around just to watch her smoke. I'm talking about Joe and Pansy, me. It used to be in a paper, a little comic picture called Hambone, and it was Hambone's Meditations, and he would say funny things. Of course, he was a little black man. We wouldn't have this today. And one I got here, it said, "Ain't nobody asking for a raise these times. They satisfied just to keep from getting unoccupied." Near where we were swinging on the trees the time that I got my own whipping from my daddy was down on the hillside, and we had a chinquapin tree down there too. It's a delicious nut. It's dark on the outside, and it's very, very good to eat. And we always enjoyed eating those chinquapins. Down in the woods behind the outdoor toilet that burned the time that Mama put the hot ashes in it, and Uncle John Hall went over to Siloam and said Charles' hotel had burned. Down behind that was, in the woods, was a muscadine vine, and we liked these muscadines too, and Mama made preserves from them and jelly. She would also go find fox grapes for this purpose, and any other grapes like that growing in the woods. Rainy days in the wintertime used to be days to burn out the chimney. You didn't get chimney sweeps to come and clean it out. My daddy would put straw in it on a rainy, rainy day, and it would burn the soot out of the chimney and make it safe. We had a shingle roof, and of course, on a day it wasn't rainy, it would have been dangerous. And this shingle roof on this house that was built in 1893 was out of riven shingles, and that meant they were made there in the woods and not bought at any store. I think I've told you Joe and I rode in the foot of the buggy, facing Mom and Papa, on a seat made of a plank. There was a piece of wood put at each end so it wouldn't slip, and we liked riding there. Another game we played school was Crack the Whip. And I was hurt one time because I was on the end, which we always wanted to be on the end, because you got more a kick out of it that way. But I was hurt one time when I was on the end at Friendship School. We played tug of war with a grapevine, and this was fun. We had two sides, and you tugged to see which one would win. And Jip was real good at that game. And I think I told you that Pansy started the Christmas trees at our house, and when she came home from nurse's training, we went over to get one. And that's when she got up in there to get the holly, and her knee slipped out of place, and I says, "Paul, I'll catch you." And speaking recently of the riven shingles, they must have been good because they were put on the house when it was built in 1893. It was not re-roofed until 1942. The first balloon I ever saw up in the air was when I was small and looked to the east, and it was going from the south to the north, and it went all the way across, and that's all we knew about it. I want to tell about the first fair I ever attended in my life, and of course it was at East Bend, and it was held down below Mr. Wiley Poindexter's, below where Travis and Nell lived. We went out in the afternoon, and I was dressed up with my black taffeta coat on and black taffeta cap that I have in a snapshot. And that afternoon, an airplane came. It was the first airplane I'd ever seen. Of course, I looked up and looked up and looked up, and I fell down over the rope that was tied to a stake to hold up one of the tents. And then that night, we stayed for the fireworks. And the little fish were up in the air and all these fireworks I'd never seen before. And I fell down again over one of the ropes at the tent. So I guess I spent more time on the ground than I did standing up at that fair. And one time we went to the Winston Fair when I was small, but that was later than this, much later. Evan came home and took us in the Model T Ford. And I remember we went uptown first to shop for some shoes or something, and then went on to the fair and spent the day. And that was a big occasion in my life. I wanted to tell about when we were in high school, we sang out of a book called The Golden Book of Favorite Songs, and that's one of the best songbooks I've ever seen. I sure would love to have one like it now. It had all the old favorites of Stephen Collins Foster's. Not only that, it had others, like When You and I Were Young, Maggie, Darla Nellie Gray, and the Spanish Cavalier, and just all these good old songs, and we used it in high school to sing when we went into chapel in the auditorium. I haven't seen one in a long, long time. As I've said before, we had the pastor, Reverend R.P. Coram, that pastored Shoals Baptist Church, Union Grove Baptist Church, Charity Baptist Church, and ours, Friendship Baptist Church, which was our home church. And we would go to these other churches when our preaching day wasn't taking place on Sunday. So I remember going to Union Grove, and we had been invited to have the Sunday dinner at Mr. and Ms. Charlie Poindexter's. He had been a sheriff, so they called him Sheriff Charlie Poindexter. And they lived right near Union Grove Baptist Church. So we went out there, and his wife was called Miss Lou Gertie. She had a real good Sunday dinner, and we were invited in to eat. I was eating at the first table. I should have waited till the second. And she poured me a glass of milk, which I liked so much when I was growing up, and still do. And I turned over my big glass of milk on her linen tablecloth, and I've never been so embarrassed in my life. But she was so kind, she tried every way so I wouldn't be embarrassed. That afternoon she had a daughter, Mary, and we went out playing, hide in the barn, and had a real good time. Going back to the influenza epidemic in 1918, there was so much fright about, people were so frightened about it, that when somebody died with it, sometimes it was real sad. And Mr. Joe Ring, who was the foreman of the railroad repairman who worked on the railroad over at Siloam, died with influenza, and there wasn't anybody go into the house to get him to bury him. And my daddy and Bob Bowes, who married my first cousin, lived next door, Irma, went over and got the body. Well, first they dug the grave up at Friendship Church, went over and got the body, and brought it up there and buried it. And my daddy and Bob never got the flu at all. And I think they felt like doing good like that, they wouldn't get it. I've told about chewing tobacco and getting sick. I'm not sure that I ever tried dipping snuff. If I did, it didn't make me sick because I don't remember about it. But for some little time back when I was growing up, Mama dipped tuberose snuff, and ain't ate it, ain't bad. I think all dipped snuff, and they'd get their toothbrushes from the woods, the black gum, and skin them down a ways and chew them, and that was the toothbrush. There were many streams, and there were no bridges over these, and if it was a big stream, they'd put footlogs across them, and the way they put a footlog across one was just to cut down a good-sized tree and lay it across and kind of trim it off on top to make it level. And often they didn't have anything to hold to or anything. You just walked across like that to get across the stream. I can remember when we took communion at Friendship Church, the members took communion. They only had it one time a year, and that was on the preaching day in May, and we called it May meeting. One glass on one side and one on the other, because of course there's two with the aisle down the center of two sides of the church, and the deacons would take it around, and one drank right after the other. And this remained the way we took communion until I was teaching school, and we brought a communion service there for Friendship Church. I can remember one saying my father had, "Let your word be your bond," and he truly believed in that. He also told us when we went to the store, there at our community store, never to go behind the counter and bother anything. Conrad Angel, who lives in our home community, Don Angel's father, told me something good about my dad one time when I was up there recently. He said that Mamie Scott's husband had died, and they had a little boy, and the husband had died with diabetes, and the little boy had diabetes. Evan used to bring the insulin for the man all the time to him, but after the husband had died, the little baby needed the doctor so much, and of course there wasn't any help then for anybody who was poor and the husband died. So my daddy told Conrad if he'd go get the doctor, he'd pay him, because that child had to have a doctor to help him. I failed to tell about visiting Piney Ridge School the year before I started. Back then, the younger children who were not old enough to go to school could go visiting, and I remember going to visit, and I think my dad's first cousin, Piney Hall, who later married Mr. Davenport, was the teacher. Speaking of the school, when I started going to school, there was 6 months school, and all the way until I got to high school, we just had 6 months. Started in October and ended in April. But before then, they'd only had 2 and 3 months school. In high school, of course, we had 8 months school. And that's when my daddy had to pay for the 2 extra months, because we didn't live in East Bend Township. We lived in Fall Creek Township. He had to pay $15 a month for the 2 extra months for each one of us. 4 of us girls were in high school at one time. There was right much money during the Depression, but he didn't grumble about it. One thing we looked forward to was the fertilizer salesman coming. My daddy sold fertilizer for 2 different companies. Pocahontas Guana Company was one. I can't recall the other one right now. And Mr. Bracken was salesman for one, and Mr. Wright for the other. Mr. Wright was from Ruffin down near Reedsville, and one time when we went to see Pansy and Dillard took my daddy over to see him, and I guess that's the last time he ever saw Mr. Wright. Mr. Bracken, I think, was from in Virginia, Lynchburg, Virginia, maybe. Anyway, they always made it convenient to spend the night at home because they liked to spend the night there, and they liked Mama's good cooking. But we were partial to Mr. Bracken. We'd rather see him come, and the reason why, he always brought a big bag of candy for us, and he would sit it on the hall table, and we didn't touch that candy, though, until he told us to. And that was a real red letter day for us when he brought us that candy. And he could tell jokes, too, one right after the other, and we liked him for that, too. First time I ever heard of basketball was when Evan was going to high school at Boonville. And he came home on a weekend and told about basketball playing. And that's the first time I ever heard of it. Later on, we played basketball at Friendship School and had some good teams, girls and boys. And that's the reason when we went on to high school, we made the team because we'd had all that practice. And some of the others had not had that privilege. I was telling about how when someone died in the community, my mother and some of the other ladies would go in and bathe the person and dress them and lay them out, they called it. And then people came and set up and had a wake that night. And they were buried the next day because there was no embalming. But later on, of course, there was a funeral home at East Bend. Mr. Rural Blakely had one, and then Mr. Burchett. And my granddaddy Fletcher was embalmed at home down in Uncle Lake. Aunt Bet's where he died, and Grandma Fletcher knew all about it and didn't want to be embalmed then when she died, and she wasn't, and she had to be buried the next day. When someone died in the community, as I've told you, Mama and some of the other ladies would go in and bathe the person and put on their clean clothes, whatever they would be buried in, and lots of times they had saved a certain dress to be buried in that they liked, and they would dress them in this and lay them out. And that's where they stayed overnight, and people came in and set up and had a wake. Then they would be buried the next day, of course. Birthday for my dad when he was 55. My mother planned it, and she didn't let us children know it. But the Sunday before, we were visiting at Mr. and Ms. Plez Matthews, and her daughter Freddie knew about it, so she told us, but we didn't let them know that we knew it. Mama was afraid we would let it be told if she had told us about it. And someone had a cake on the table, 55, and had a big table out in the backyard, a long table with everybody brought potluck. It was a real good meal. I remember a lot of people went inside, and there were so many people we didn't have chairs for all. And Miss Cleta Kirk took my little chair that's in the den now and turned it over on the side and sat on it. And I stood and looked at her, and I didn't like that a bit because she was a large woman, and I just knew she was going to break my little chair that my dad had brought off of a truck that came through selling chairs through the country. And I wanted to keep my little chair, which I still have today. I remember my daddy wore a black bow tie that was tied, and Mama always tied it for him, and it looked real nice. A custom back in the olden days when a girl was married, the father gave her a bedroom suit and a cow. And Mama had this bedroom suit that Granddaddy Fletcher had given her when she was married upstairs in our south room in the guest room. And it was golden oak, and Pansy got that when we divided up the things. One thing we did when we were little was get a June bug and tie a string to its leg and throw it around and hear it buzz. That was a lot of fun to us, but it probably wasn't to the June bug. We got lightning bugs too and put them in a jar, and Margaret did that when she was little in the backyard here. We had a lot of hollyhocks growing out near the garden, and they were old-fashioned flowers, and I used to go and get a bloom off with catch a bee in it and hold the petals together and make the bee buzz. That was a lot of fun for me, but maybe that wasn't for that was a lot of fun for me, but maybe that wasn't a lot of fun for the bee inside the flower. My dad had a river farm that was called the Starling Farm, and there was a family graveyard on it that he kept cleaned off where the Starlings were buried. And they had lived at a house place right out from there, their home place, and it said he never put any money in the bank, and that he hid it under his hearth. And we used to want to go out there and dig where that hearth was in that house, see if we could find his money, but we never did. Friendship Baptist Church was called White Oak Limb a long time ago. I want to remember that. And Smithtown one time was called Poindexter, and that was a post office at that time at Smithtown. There's Mr. Poindexter lived down the road from us. Used to say he could eat and sleep, but he didn't feel like work, and my dad used to get a kick out of telling that. we swapped priming tobacco with the neighbors, and with the Hoosiers and the Flynn's, and you put sticks and tears in the tobacco barn, and then you fired it a little bit while it yellowed, and then when it's yellow enough, you started firing it to make it real hot. You put the thermometer in the barn to know the heat. You put wood in the furnaces, and that's where you cooked your tobacco in the olden days. I mentioned that Friendship Baptist Church was once called White Oak Glen, and they didn't have anybody to look after the cemetery, and the people would go in and clean it off. I remember my dad going in and helping clean it off, and especially before the protracted meeting, they called it, or the big meeting in July, which was the big meeting for the year. Uncle Ike Hall was the mail carrier, and he carried the mail first in a buggy, and he'd go to sleep sometime, but that horse knew just exactly how to take that mail around to the boxes. And he would give us 2 deliveries after he was carrying from East Bend. He would come back, and going down the road to his house, back of the house, he'd blow the horn if we had some mail, and we'd go over there and get it. So we had 2 deliveries a day. There's a lime rock above the river above Siloam, and I'm sure they worked there and got lime, and they had a trolley there at one time. When I was in the 7th grade at Friendship School, we went over there on a picnic for our class room's picnic, and we went all over that rock that day. And no wonder I can walk well now, because I walked to school that morning, which was about a mile. We walked all the way over to the Lime Rock, which was at least 2 or 3 miles. Walked all over the Lime Rock that day after we ate our lunch. Walked back to school, and walked back home. Walked back up to school that night to practice with the message, and walked back home. I can remember things that was sold for a nickel when I was growing up. Was a soft drink, and sometimes we'd get one each from Mr. Cranax's store. Hot dog was 5 cents. Ice cream cone was 5 cents. A pack of chewing gum was 5 cents. A box of chiclets was 5 cents. A loaf of bread was 10 cents. At first it wasn't even sliced, but later they sliced it. But Mama made our bread usually anyway, so we didn't start buying bread until later. We made homemade ice cream on Sunday afternoons especially, and that was a good pastime. We were never kept out of school, even in elementary grades, to work. Our dad believed in education, and he wanted us to be in school, and that's where we were. Some of the neighbors' children did stay out to work. We went to school, and we played games. Town ball was the game we played, fox and geese, tap, and many others. I read all the books I could read at Friendship School. The library was very small, and I read Mary Queen of Scots before I was really old enough to understand it, and I never did like Queen Elizabeth I because she had her beheaded. When someone died in the community, the men would go in the community and dig the grave, and I can remember my dad helping do that. You let your work go in order to go help dig the grave of that person. There were many sayings back in those days, and one my dad used a lot was, "Let your word be your bond." And he also said he was told when he was little not to go behind the counter in the store. Conrad Angel told me something about him that did me a world of good recently. He said that when mainly Scott's husband died, if Scott died, they had a little child that was sick with diabetes just like the father was. They even brought the insulin for the father to take. But my dad told Conrad if he'd go get the doctor, he'd pay him to come see that little child, which he did. I remember visiting Piney Ridge before I went. I entered fall of 1920, but I think I visited the year before that. And I really enjoyed the first year. Mr. Owen Reese was the teacher, and I gave out the treats at Christmas, and that was a big thing for me to do, I thought. My dad sold fertilizer, and he had a fertilizer salesman that came and stayed at home because they liked Mama's good cooking, and they always made a point to spend the night there in our company room. Mr. Bracken was one and Mr. Wright was the other. Mr. Wright was from Ruffin near Reedsville. Mr. Bracken, I think, was from Danville. He was the one that could tell the jokes, and we liked him for that. And he always brought a big sack of candy for us children, and he'd set it down on the table in the hall, and we never got it until we were told to go get it. First time I ever heard of basketball was when Evan was in high school at Boonville, and he came home telling about basketball, and that's the first time I'd ever heard about it. Then we played at Friendship later, and we're good players, and we're always the best players in high school because we'd had so much experience playing in our elementary school, and other schools didn't have that. Roosters crowed in the community, and that was like an alarm clock, and we didn't have any cowbells on our cows, but some people did. There was a little corn mill, right below the church there, Mr. Will Moss had, and he didn't have to grind flour for wheat for flour, but he did grind corn for cornmeal and for feed for the cows. I love to hear whippoorwills because we heard them when we were growing up, and I've never heard one since I've been living here. But we heard a lot of whippoorwills at the home place, Bob White's, and also the cooing of doves. And Evans told me recently that Papa told him never to kill a dove because it was a sacred bird. When I was in elementary grades at Friendship School, the first gift I ever got off the Christmas tree was a beaded bag from a boy, and the next year I got an Ingersoll watch. I got mad at the one that gave it to me and gave it back to him one day. I wrapped it up in a sheet of tablet paper and laid it on his desk and told him to keep it. I didn't want it. I've heard Mama tell about in 1900 there was a total eclipse of the sun, and chickens went to roost because they thought it was nighttime. It was so dark. I remember the farm machinery my daddy had. He had a lot of machinery. He had a disc harrow, a drag harrow, a fertilizer distributor, a corn planter, a hay rake, and a log wagon. There was a Nissen wagon, the mowing machine, and the cultivators, a Dixie plow, and a cradle to cut the grain. Had a buggy. I remember riding in the buggy, and had a mowing blade that you could use, one person could use it, which was real hard work. I remember carrying the bundles when he cut the grain with the cradle, and that was hard work for me, I thought, because I had to take 12 bundles to one place for them to make a stack out of it. Later they used a reaper for this cut grain. My daddy had a thrash machine, but that was before my time. I've heard my parents speak of McGuffey's Readers and the blue-black speller, but that was never in school when I was going. One plow I left off the name that my dad had was a bull-tongue plow, and that just made one little furrow, and that wasn't used much in the last days I knew about farming. I just told about Uncle Ike Hall carrying the mail in a buggy. Well, later he carried it in a Ford Roadster when he was carrying from East Bend, and he would give us 2 deliveries a day then when he came back from East Bend after he had delivered the mail, started up for the next day. But when he was carrying from Siloam, if it came a flood or the river froze over, he couldn't get across to get the mail, and so he built the first chairlift and put across the river, and I have a picture of it today. Uncle Pearl and Aunt Julius Matthews moved to Sand Hills about 1913. That's what they call the land down about Carthage and Sanford. And they lived at the place called White Hill. All the children were born in Yadkin County except James, the youngest one, was born down there. I've just thought of something that was a long time ago. There was a man in the community with Wiley Brown, Mr. Bud Brown's son, who had a little Jenny, a little mule, and they were probably the Raleigh products, but he came around from place to place selling the products that way. Horse trading went on back then too, and especially during court week at Youngville, they'd have their horses there to trade, and people wanted good horses for their farming year. Of course, my daddy kept the same ones year after year. He had some good ones before that I don't remember, one called Old Rube that he thought a lot of, but the ones I remember were Frank and Charlie. Paul Kirk, Max Kirk's father, was a horse trader, and that's the way he got down Yadkin County, and the way Hattie Angel met him and married him. Whittling was a pastime back in those days, and a lot of people were real good at whittling and made many different things at whittling. And talking about the horses, I can remember G meant to go to the right, and Ha meant go to the left, and Whoa, of course, meant stop. And that's what you said to the horses. One of the evangelists back in my day when I was little was Billy Sunday. And once I called Billy Graham Billy Sunday, and that kind of dated me. But he had a revival down here, preaching in the warehouse. And I came down in the Model T with Papa and Mama and Joe and Pansy and some other of the children, and we went to that service in the warehouse, and I've never forgotten it. Back in those days, in my younger days, they didn't have highway crews paid with the state to work the roads. They were all dirt roads, and they had to be kept up. So in the township, certain men were responsible for keeping the roads, and they worked them. And I remember my daddy having a certain kind of a sled made out of planks that was used to clean out the side ditches, and I remember seeing him doing that on the roads there up toward Uncle Bob Angel's. So they kept their own roads up back in those olden days. There is now a hollering contest every year at Spivey's Corner. We had hollering back in, and when I was a child too, people wanted to get word to somebody at the next farm. They would go out and yell across the hill, and they would hear them. We had the largest walnut tree I've ever seen out in Grandpa Hall's house's yard, and we got the walnuts off of there and used them in the wintertime. And even after I moved here, I got walnuts up there to go in my fruit cakes. But it was a beautiful tree, and my daddy built Mama a hen house there for her precious chickens that she thought so much of under that walnut tree, and that's where they laid their eggs and where she fed them, and they roosted in there too. It was a nice hen house. In telling my childhood memories, I've mentioned the flu of 1918 and how people wore asafoetida tied around their necks to keep from getting it. I remember this about it. Mr. Joe Ring, the foreman of the railroad crew at Siloam, died with the flu, and everybody was so afraid of it, nobody wanted to go around. But my dad and Bob Bowes, who married my first cousin next door, Irma, went over and took him to Friendship Cemetery and buried him. And of course they had dug the grave. I guess they'd had help with that. But my dad said he would not get the flu doing a good deed, and he didn't get it at all. I remember the Burma shave signs even up till I was grown, and they would be on different posts, and you'd read them as you went along. And this is one that they had. They started having them in 1925, and this is one that they had, and it was on about 6 different posts. Pedro walked back home, by golly. His bristly chin was hot tamale. Use Burma shave. I remember when Floyd Collins was in a cave in Kentucky, and they were trying to get him out, and he was fastened in the cave, and they wrote a song about him, about Floyd Collins. I remember too Will Rogers, and I remember when he was killed, I was at the beach with Pansy and Mr. and Miss Faust. I think it's the first time I was ever at the beach, or second time one. And somebody went downtown, and they came back there to the cottage telling Will Rogers was dead. I hope I haven't already told this on this tape.